Well, you've probably never heard of primary dystonia, Michelle. It's a movement disorder that causes involuntary muscle contractions. No medications for it, but there is now a surgery. Think driving is no big deal? Think again. For 19-year-old Ed Cwalinski, it's a newfound freedom he thought he'd never have. In fact, his ability to walk is something of a small miracle. Ed has a very rare movement disorder called primary dystonia.
I wanted to get better because I was living through how I couldn't take it anymore.
This is what he couldn't take anymore. Involuntary muscle contractions that contorted his body into abnormal, sometimes painful movements and postures. What began as writer's cramp progressed. By age 16, Ed could no longer walk, feed, bathe, or even dress himself.
Oh, I wanted to, yeah.
You wanted to end it?
I wanted to end it, yeah.
Ed's parents took him to several hospitals, even Columbia University in New York. Despite myriad medications and tests, the diagnosis remained elusive until he came here.
Well, they got to Dr. Baser, who specializes in the movement disorders, and diagnosed that. We sent him for the blood tests, and the genetic markers verified that it was primary dystonia, which really doesn't have a good treatment.
That changed when Dr. Whiting tried a treatment normally used for Parkinson's disease, bilateral deep brain stimulation.
I was all for it. No,
really?
Yeah.
No fear?
No fear at all.
We've all heard that expression, looking for the proverbial needle in the haystack. Well, that's exactly what neurosurgeons had to do to fix Ed's problem. We all have billions of neurons in our brains, no wider than a human hair. They had to find just one. The one that was causing Ed's involuntary contractions. Finding it took more than an hour. Success is marked by sound much like popping corn. Stimulation takes place while Ed is awake.
The premise is putting an electrode into the mid part of the brain to short circuit the abnormal electrical activity.
Magnet-controlled electrodes on each side of Ed's brain smoothed out his motor functions and freed him of abnormal motions and spasms. He's now a straight-A student at ITT Technical Institute, where he's majoring in computers. And his life?
Magnificent.
Yeah. Dystonia also affects Ed's speech muscles, but that will improve with time. Lot more to his story tomorrow night at 10 o'clock on ABC's 2020.
How incredible.
Neat
Just
kid.
incredible.
Absolutely.
Now, does this treatment offer him any type of a cure?
Unfortunately, it does not. I mean, it only treats the symptoms. A cure is years away, but at least there is now a treatment that can ease the weight.
My goodness. Well, good for him.
Yeah,
I'm so glad they
rooting for
figured
him.
that out.
Yeah.
Wow. Marilyn, thanks.
Sure.
This is 2020 with Barbara Walters. Tonight, he was like any other teenager, active and athletic, until one day his brain misfired and made his body useless. Then, a radical new treatment. 2020 cameras take you into the operating room, a delicate surgery, and a medical miracle.
Oh my gosh, it was dramatic. It's hard to keep from choking up about it because he's such a nice kid.
Dr. Timothy Johnson tells us all about Ed. When we return, a teenager with a brain that went haywire, his body twisted like a pretzel, then a probe into his brain.
He came out with a smile on his face, and I knew everything went okay when he smiled.
2020 continues. Once again, Connie Chung.
Our next story is very unusual. It's a real-life story in which things work out just the way you want them to. It's about a teenager named Ed, active, athletic, and then one day, his brain began to send the wrong signals to his body. Life became impossible. He could barely walk or move. And then came hope, a medical miracle. You're about to see an operation that will just have you on the edge of your seat and watch a boy get his life back. Dr. Timothy Johnson tells us all about Ed.
Eddie was always a good child. He was active, smart. Then all of a sudden, something like this comes on. It's like, how could this happen?
For years, Emily and Ed Cwalinski thought they had a perfect little boy. They had no clue that their precious only child harbored an ailment so treacherous and mysterious it would eventually tear their world apart. At first, the symptoms were easily ignored. In 6th grade, young Eddie complained of a writer's cramp, but the muscle pain never went away, and slowly it began to move up his arm to his shoulder.
Playing baseball, he couldn't throw the ball like he used to. And of course, the coaches are saying, come on, Ed, you can throw that ball.
In high school, Ed loved girls, sports, and computers, but something terrible was happening to his body. And by the time he was 17 years old, his life as a normal teenager was over.
He could get up and walk, but he'd be falling all over the place, and he'd be stumble up the steps, or he'd try to feed himself, and the food would be flying everywhere. And
I couldn't eat, I couldn't use the bathroom, I couldn't walk.
This is what his life had become. His muscles twisting and contorting his body into bizarre and painful postures, crippling him with hideous spasms and uncontrollable movements. The family went from doctor to doctor trying to find out what this was. One doctor even suggested it was all in his head. They began to lose hope.
heartbreaking, very heartbreaking.
It was just devastating to see their only child just deteriorate before your eyes and their eyes, and really being powerless to do anything about it.
Dr. Susan Baser, a neurologist at Pittsburgh's Allegheny General Hospital, was the doctor who finally gave Ed's nightmare a name.
What Ed has is called dystonia. It's a chronic condition that causes muscles to contract abnormally. Over 300,000 Americans have it, usually in a form that affects only one part of the body. Ed has a rare form that affects his entire body. Nobody knows how he got it, and there is no cure for it.
When they said there wasn't any cure, then, well, that was devastating.
There are medications that can sometimes help control dystonia. But incredibly, as if this family had not suffered enough, none of them worked for Ed. Within a year of being diagnosed, Ed was spending most of his day curled up in bed in the fetal position.
My mom, she cried every day, and my dad, and he started crying. I tried not to cry, but then at the end, I just let it out. I couldn't take it anymore. When it got really bad, I was ready to, think about kicking it,
Kicking it.
Yeah.
Kicking it, teenage slang for suicide.
And what could you say to him as parents at that point?
Eddie, we'll find somebody who'll do something for it. Just give us time. He said he just can't take it no more.
Ed had hit bottom. It was now time for drastic measures. Dr. Donald Whiting, a neurosurgeon also at Allegheny General, proposed one last option: deep brain stimulation, DBS for short. But he said the odds were only 50-50 it would work.
The family really understood it very well and understood that they could expect nothing for sure.
DBS had been used in only a handful of dystonia patients, and if Ed agreed to undergo this radical treatment, he would be the youngest person in America ever to have it. Nonetheless, in the spring of last year, Ed put his life in Dr. Whiting's hands and underwent brain surgery. Dr. Whiting screws a metal halo on Ed's head to help him navigate safely deep into Ed's brain. He believes that Ed's muscles are clenching so tightly and constantly because the nerve cells in his brain that control muscle movements are firing too fast. But there are millions of nerve cells in the brain, and finding which ones are causing Ed's symptoms is like finding a needle in a haystack. The surgical team will actually try to find the abnormal nerve cells by listening to them with a tiny microphone that they can push deep into his brain. Different nerve cells produce different sounds as they give off electrical impulses. To us, it all sounds like radio static, but to the surgeons, it's a sound map through Ed's brain. Remarkably, the brain itself feels no pain, so Ed is awake during the procedure.
You okay, Ed? Yeah, good. Hang in there. They're just doing some recording.
Everyone in the operating room listens closely to the crackling nerve cells. Finally, they hear something.
Yeah, so that's definitely the right spot.
It sounds like the right spot, but there's only one way to know for sure. Dr. Whiting will send a small amount of voltage to that area in Ed's brain. Hopefully, it will tell his nerve cells to slow down, causing his stiff and contorted body to move more normally. But that's the best case scenario. His doctors are much more realistic.
I was just hopeful that we wanted to relieve some of his pain because he was, towards the end, was like begging us to do the surgery.
Dr. Baser has been by Ed's side during the entire operation. She's been desperate for a breakthrough since Ed and his family first walked into her office. She waits anxiously as Dr. Whiting sends tiny volts of electricity to Ed's brain. Can this current actually reset Ed's brain and free his gnarled muscles? She flexes his wrist. Amazingly, it moves normally. The first time in nearly 2 years.
Oh my gosh, it was dramatic. It's hard to keep from choking up about it because he's such a nice kid.
It was the miracle they were hoping for. Ed's mother knew it the moment Dr. Whiting came out of surgery.
He came out with a smile on his face, and I knew everything went okay when he smiled.
Ed now has 2 electrodes in his brain, one for each side of his body. These wires constantly emit a steady stream of electrical pulses that will allow his muscles to move freely. If the electrical pulses stop, the symptoms will return. These electrodes are powered by 2 small batteries that are implanted in Ed's chest. This is Ed just 8 days after surgery. The turnaround is remarkable. DBS is quite simply working like a pacemaker for his brain. It doesn't cure the dystonia, but it controls it without destroying any brain tissue.
He went from being a bedridden individual to a normal kid again.
It's wonderful. I just thank God for, giving this to me,
You felt like your life had been given back to you.
Yes.
Ed's slightly slurred speech is caused by medication he takes to prevent seizures. But as he improves with DBS, he is able to reduce the medication.
Okay, now open your eyes.
He has periodic checkups to fine-tune the voltage to better control his symptoms.
What you can see, the battery here underneath the skin, the incision, and then you can get the outline of the cable going up his neck. And on the opposite side, you see the same thing. You can see the incision line right there hidden by his hair.
It's actually this simple to adjust the electrical current with a magnetic wand that gets passed over the battery.
And then we're going to turn down his one setting, the pulse width, down just a little bit.
The wires in his brain should last at least 10 years, and they can be replaced when necessary. Last spring, Ed reached a milestone no one ever thought he'd see.
Edward Jason Cwalinski.
He walked across the stage at his high school graduation.
And everyone stood up and applauded. It was emotional. We're going to get through this. They're going to find a cure.
Until they do, thanks to DBS, Ed's been given back the one thing he missed most, a normal life. Hanging out with his friends, you might never guess he's been through such a life-threatening ordeal. And that's exactly how Ed wants it. Still, this typical college student is in reality a medical trailblazer, and his doctors are understandably cautious about his future. But when you look at where he was and how far he has come with the love of his family and the skills of the doctors, they all admit they're thrilled.
Ed is returning to college next month. If you like, you can speak to Ed's doctor online. Just go to our website, abcnews.com, for details.
For some of the 300,000 Americans suffering from the neurological disorder dystonia, the FDA has just approved an implantable pacemaker which could tame the involuntary muscle contractions which makes the severest form of dystonia so debilitating. It all started several years ago when a young athlete suffering from dystonia had an experimental pacemaker implanted in a surgery which transformed his life. We get his story now from medical editor Dr. Tim Johnson in this edition of Dr. Tim on Call.
For years, Emily and Ed Cwalinski thought they had a perfect little boy, without a clue that their precious only child harbored an ailment so treacherous and mysterious it would eventually tear their world apart. In high school, Ed loved girls, sports, and computers, but something terrible was happening to his body. By the time he was 17 years old, his life as a normal teenager was over.
He could get up and walk, but he'd be falling all over the place.
This is what Ed's life had become. His muscles twisting and contorting his body into bizarre postures, crippling him with painful spasms and uncontrollable movements. Dr. Susan Baser, a neurologist at Pittsburgh's Allegheny General Hospital, was the doctor who finally gave Ed's nightmare a name. She said Ed was suffering from dystonia. It's a chronic disorder that makes muscles contract abnormally. Dystonia usually targets only one specific part of the body, and more than 300,000 people in America suffer from it. Ed had a rare form that affected his entire body. No one knows how he got it, and there was no cure. Dr. Donald Whiting, a neurosurgeon also at Allegheny General, proposed one last option, deep brain stimulation, DBS for short. He said the odds were only 50-50 it would work. So in the spring of 2000, Ed put his life in Dr. Whiting's hands and underwent brain surgery. Dr. Whiting screws a metal halo on Ed's head to help him navigate safely deep into Ed's brain. He believes that Ed's muscles are clenching so tightly and constantly because the nerve cells in his brain that control muscle movements are firing too fast. But there are millions of nerve cells in the brain, and finding which ones are causing Ed's symptoms is like finding a needle in a haystack. The surgical team will actually try to find the abnormal nerve cells by listening to them with a thin wire that's been fitted with a tiny microphone that they will push deep into his brain. Nerve cells produce sounds each time they give off an electrical impulse. Those sounds from different parts of the brain are like fingerprints. Dr. Baser has been by Ed's side during the entire surgery. She waits anxiously as Dr. Whiting sends tiny volts of electricity to Ed's brain. Can this current actually reset Ed's brain and free his gnarled muscles? She flexes his wrist. Amazingly, it moves normally. The first time in nearly 2 years.
Oh my gosh, it was dramatic. It's hard to keep from choking up about it because he's such a nice kid.
The doctors implanted 2 electrodes in the part of Ed's brain that causes his dystonia. These wires will now constantly emit a steady stream of electrical pulses that will allow his muscles to move freely. If the electrical pulses stop, the symptoms will return. These electrodes are powered by 2 small batteries that are implanted in Ed's chest. This is Ed just 8 days after surgery. The turnaround is remarkable. DBS is, quite simply, working like a pacemaker for the brain. It doesn't cure his dystonia, but it controls it without destroying any brain tissue.
He went from being a bedridden individual to a normal kid again.
It's wonderful. I just thank God for, giving this to me,
And Dr. Tim Johnson joins us now. Tim, these stories never cease to amaze me, and that was Ed speaking.
That was Ed speaking. He was still on some medication, so his speech wasn't quite as good as it is now. He's continued to improve. I saw some pictures recently of him playing football with his friends.
Wow.
He graduated from computer school 4 months ago, has a job as a computer program, getting better all the time. So it really, I don't use the word lightly, but it was for him an absolute miracle.
And it's not a cure.
It doesn't treat the underlying disease because we really don't know what that is,
right.
But it controls it. And these electrodes to the brain can be replaced over time as necessary. You haven't destroyed any brain tissue, so if someday a good cure is found, you can take these electrodes out. But in the meantime, they give him his life back.
And it is now available, this type of pacemaker, to others suffering?
It's been made available, approved for so-called humanitarian use. That is for people with the most severe forms of the disease, like Ed. Estimates are that maybe 4,000 or 5,000 people a year will have these pacemakers now under this new approval.
Fantastic. Tim, thank you.
All right.
Always good.
Other news, thousands of Americans suffer from movement disorders, things like Parkinson's disease, dystonia, and tremors. Dr. Maria from the KDKA health team sees people with all kinds of disorders like this in her Beaver County neurology practice, and she's here now with more on some high-tech treatments going on right here in Pittsburgh. Maria.
One treatment is called deep brain stimulation. It helps people with Parkinson's disease, but this implanted device can also help people with other types of movement disorders. As a teen, Ed Cwalinski started having symptoms of dystonia, a condition where his muscles would contract beyond his control.
I was pretty much immobile, couldn't do anything for myself. I had to have assistance for pretty much everything: bathing, putting my clothes on, eating, going to bed.
Almost 4 years ago, he had deep brain stimulators put in, one side at a time. The batteries are placed in his chest, and electrical impulses travel along wires to the part of his brain called the globus pallidus, which is important to smooth movement. His walking and handwriting improved. Now, at age 22, he is an information systems technician for the County Bar Association. But a few weeks ago, he developed a problem.
The wire came out of the battery, and when that happened, all my symptoms came back.
His neurosurgeon, Donald Whiting, had put in a new, larger battery and had to fix the wire. Because Ed needs higher settings to control his symptoms, his batteries wear out more quickly.
This is the newer battery, which is twice the size, a little bit thicker, and it has a longer battery life.
With some of the older models, tension on the wires at the neck caused breakage, but a connector at the skull base seems to have relieved this. Another issue with deep brain stimulation is you can't have an MRI scan, and some people have unpleasant tingling, weakness, or slurred speech when it's activated. The settings used for dystonia are not FDA approved, but for some people like Ed with severe symptoms from a movement disorder, it can improve their quality of life. From the health team, I'm Dr. Maria Sembra, KDKA TV News.
Really incredible stuff. Very interesting story, Dr. Maria. Where else is deep brain stimulation being used?
Well, according to Dr. Whiting, physicians in Europe have been doing this kind of surgery for more than 15 years. There, they do it more as a first-line treatment, but here it's usually done only after medications have failed.
All right, Maria, thanks very much. And to read Dr. Maria's report on how deep brain stimulation can treat movement disorders, go to kdka.com. We also have all the reports from the KDKA health team there for you.
Sometimes things in life go terribly wrong. A young athlete develops a mysterious and debilitating condition.
We took a lot of different doctors. We couldn't find out what was wrong with them.
These people suffered one-of-a-kind conditions. Their lives depended on one-of-a-kind medical treatment. These are their amazing stories. Ed Cwalinski grew up as an only child in the quiet town of Dystonia, Pennsylvania, just north of Pittsburgh.
He was always a good kid, good-natured, active in sports. He liked to go out with his friends, liked to swim, go camping.
Ed earned straight A's, excelled in baseball, and had plenty of friends. Then in junior high, he suddenly began experiencing odd pains.
Started having little cramps, this in his arms, cramps, this and that, and we wasn't paying no attention. We figured teenagers.
The cramps in his right hand became so bad that Ed taught himself to write left-handed. An orthopedist told Ed his shoulder blade was distorted and that he'd have to stop playing baseball.
That took a toll on me. Something I played for 11 years, then you have to give it up. You know, it's really tough.
And it got tougher. Over the next year, inexplicable muscle contractions began contorting Ed's body.
I would just have spasms coming off my back and to my head and throughout my limbs. They would just be shaking.
Doctors were baffled.
We took a lot of different doctors. We couldn't find out what was wrong with them. We took them so many different places.
Like, I don't know how a healthy child could turn into a distorted, unhappy child.
By 16, the spasms were constant, forcing Ed's body into painful contortions. He left school to be tutored at home and was hospitalized repeatedly.
I just couldn't take the spasms every day and the constant not being able to do anything by myself right now. I didn't want to live anymore.
Because it come to the point where he was so bad, I was afraid to leave him home by himself.
Then one day, a glimmer of hope.
I just happened to past the TV, and it was Dr. Baser and Dr. Whiting together talking about movement disorders. And I thought, well, these two doctors know what they're talking about. So I gave them a call.
The family met with Dr. Susan Baser, a neurologist at Pittsburgh's Allegheny General Hospital. But their hopes were quickly dashed.
All the testing we did came back negative, and he had no family history of movement disorder. There was no trauma, and it was just such a hyperacute presentation. There was really not an adequate explanation for his symptoms.
Dr. Baser suggested getting another opinion from the National Institutes of Health. There, experts finally diagnosed Ed with an extreme case of dystonia, a neurological condition that, in a milder form, affects 1 in 1,000 people. Though its origin is unknown, it is basically a malfunctioning of the brain cells that control muscle movement.
Normally, when you go to contract a muscle, like say your biceps muscle, you normally have to relax the opposite muscle, your triceps muscle. With dystonia, what happens, you have co-contraction, so both muscles will contract simultaneously and causes sustained or abnormal posture.
Okay, good. Okay.
Most of the 300,000 cases of dystonia in the U.S. affect just one body part. Ed's type is extremely rare, affecting his entire body. Ed and his parents were told there is no cure.
That was devastating. And all I can imagine him in the rest of his life in a wheelchair.
There was one chance, an experimental surgery that could potentially restore Ed's muscle control. Dr. Baser's colleague at Allegheny General Hospital, Dr. Donald Whiting, is one of the few neurosurgeons in the world with expertise in deep brain stimulation.
What we do is, with surgery, we put an electrode into that malfunctioning area to get it to fire correctly and to get everything back synchronous again.
With deep brain stimulation, an electrode is placed into the brain. Powered by a small battery implanted in the chest, it sends an electrical current through the hyperactive cells, slowing them down and stopping the contractions. The technique was first used in patients with other tremor disorders, like Parkinson's and MS. Dr. Whiting has refined the procedure and is now testing it for treatment of dystonia. But there are risks to the surgery.
With this particular type of surgery, there's a 1.5% chance of something bad happening, bleeding, stroke, coma, or even death. So it's not a risk-free kind of thing.
So do you want, okay, so you still want to win.
At 18, Ed would be the youngest person ever to undergo the procedure. Despite the risks and the lack of any guarantee that the experimental surgery would work, Ed and his parents jumped at the chance.
Eddie could not live the way he was. Eventually, he just would have died, I'm sure.
A computerized halo projecting specific coordinates of Ed's brain based on MRIs and CAT scans is screwed to his skull. It will guide Dr. Whiting to the exact area of the brain.
Our target area is probably about 6 millimeters by 8 millimeters in size, so it's very, very small. So what we need to do, number one, is be very accurate, because there's a lot of other important structures around that area, and it's kind of what we call high-priced real estate in that area, because everything within every millimeter or two, there's something different that's very, very important.
A small hole is drilled into Ed's skull. A micro-recording electrode, thinner than a human hair, is slowly inserted into the brain. The electrode is fine enough to slip through the neural pathways without causing damage. Ed is sedated, but awake enough to communicate, so doctors can avoid critical speech and memory portions of his brain. The tiny electrode slowly passes through and transmits the sounds of millions of Ed's brain cells.
So as you pass through the different layers of nerve cells, they have certain characteristics. You listen to them, and certain cells fire or make a popping noise on the monitor at a certain rate. You hear pop, 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 and then you go through areas that are electrically silent.
To the untrained ear, it sounds like static. But to an experienced neurosurgeon, the overactive cells sound different.
Sometimes we'll say the sound of popcorn popping is whenever you have a tremor cell. it sounds sort of like popcorn popping in the microwave.
Once the hyperactive cells are located, a low-level current is passed through the electrode. This is the moment of truth. If the deep brain stimulation is going to work for Ed, there should be some clear indication almost immediately. As soon as the electrode is activated, Dr. Baser, who's been by Ed's side throughout the surgery, notices something. Ed's hand has stopped contracting.
My hand. Okay, good. It was just miraculous. It was more than I could have ever expected.
The change is dramatic, far exceeding everyone's expectations. Within days, Ed's regained control of his body. For the first time in years, he is not suffering painful contractions.
I just felt relaxed for the first time in 2 years. It felt so good, you know, to have some kind of relief.
Edward Jason Cwalinski.
A month after his surgery, Ed walked across the stage to receive his high school diploma.
They all gave me a standing ovation, and that felt pretty good.
The only problem Ed's had since his surgery is having a battery run out of power. When that happens, his symptoms immediately return.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate it for showing up. Thanks for supporting me through our rough times. I appreciate it.
Ed's one of the most dramatic examples I've ever seen for controlling the symptoms, and there's no reason to suspect that as long as the disease doesn't progress rapidly, we shouldn't be able to keep those under control.
It definitely gave me that life back.
It's as if the body declared war on itself. Movement disorders such as Parkinson's disease, essential tremor, and dystonia wreak havoc on the neuromuscular system. At Allegheny General, physicians like neurosurgeon Don Whiting and neurologist Susan Baser are pioneering a procedure called deep brain stimulation to eliminate or greatly reduce the tremors or muscular contractions of those conditions. Using advanced microtechnology, physicians determine the precise source of the abnormal movements within the brain. Tiny electrodes are implanted and attached to a pacemaker-sized generator. A low-voltage charge blocks or overrides the brain signals that cause the tremors. For people with movement disorders like Ed Cwalinski, Allegheny General's leading expertise in deep brain stimulation has allowed him to reclaim his body and his life. Allegheny General Hospital, distinguished by excellence.